Your story's
At
going
15 miles an hour,
to be shared with everyone.
pull over, stop. I didn't dare shut it off because I knew it was gonna happen. I had a little mitten that I took the oil cap off of, and poured more oil. At every little podunk stop there, I was buying cases of oil, so we would make it to where we get an oil filter.
So you, on YouTube, you just called all those villages podunk. But
Well,
that's
some of them are.
all of them. Okay, so the main thing that we're looking at is an incredibly famous argument, probably one of the most famous arguments there is in the history of arguments, and that is the ontological argument. I'll spell it for you. Actually, why use this is
It's
such a
on
primitive
Wikipedia.
device? Pardon?
It's like in the first paragraph or two of Anselm's description on Wikipedia.
So ontological.
Oh, yeah, it's right there. The ontological argument for the existence of God.
Yes. You see it?
Right towards the
Oh,
bottom.
right here. Okay. So, ontos is Greek for thing or definition of a thing. So, ontology is the study of what there is, what exists. And I know that must sound like, well, this relatively recent receipt from Barnes and Nobles says, buy one fresh baked cookie, get one free. It's from this book, I suppose. So yeah, it seems like a dumb, for modern Americans that believe in pragmatism, that doesn't seem like anything we should argue over on what there is. But historically, of course, it's like one of the big questions: what exists? Because Plato thought that the invisible things were the real things, and this stuff is just temporary. So these aren't real as far as Plato is concerned. So the issue becomes, in the Middle Ages, the issue over universals. Because in a sense, when you talk about horses, you've got individual horses. Americans would not have any problems with, okay, all those horses exist. But does horseness exist as a class? Is there such a thing as horseness? Normally, as Americans, I think today we would not say yes, there's such a thing as horseness. Mathematicians get a little bit more upset, though, when you say no, because they think there is a real thing such as triangularity and equivalence and mathematical numbers. Do numbers exist? Mathematicians tend to be Platonists and think that they do, because they love them. And I think that forms some sort of an attachment. And for you to tell them that stuff doesn't really exist bothers them. I don't know. Does love exist in the world? Songs act like it does, but what do we mean by all of that? So ontology is really the study of, even today, of what you could say exists. And actually, the common sense point of view, it might not surprise you, it's not what most of the educated elite, especially physicists, think exists. As far as they're concerned, ontology today is math. That's Alain Badiou. That's Logic of Worlds. So, Alain Badiou is a French philosopher, contemporary philosopher. He's in his 80s, I think, today, and he would be one that I would point to as an example of someone who's doing contemporary philosophy in a way that tries to describe the big picture in a way that takes into account all of the issues that are currently involved, especially physics, mathematics, things of that sort, He basically argues that everything can be interpreted as mathematical, as sets. So it's set theory applied to everything. So ontology still exists, it's still a science, and this is a philosopher who's a contemporary example, who's doing ontology and arguing that the newest development in that regard is to think of all things as understood in a mathematical conceptual schema that explains all their characteristics. So basically the kind of thing you could write the code for on a computer to describe the characteristics of the thing. You might think in terms of virtual reality as part of that. But it is everything is a collection of particles in an arrangement. So basically, and by the way, we don't have actual objects anymore. So the logical languages that we use in order to describe things today are predicate languages. Predicates are actions, characteristics, things that they're doing. We used to have, like in English, we had subjects that then would be doing something. So like I'm walking across the room, I'm the object and I'm performing an action, right? So the subject of the sentence is the idiot in the green sweater, and the action is walking across the room, acting like, well, that's entertaining, etc. Maybe not. In contemporary physics, you don't have objects because when you get right down to the quantum particles, they're in and out of existence. So they don't actually exist long enough for them to be things. And so instead of things, what we have are arrangements that persist and move on to other situations. So it's organization or a complex system in an arrangement that exists. But that arrangement is the characteristic that it's behaving in at the moment. So that's the predicate. So instead of actually describing things as things, we describe them as variables. Okay, so that's not going to happen because that's out of ink. E is to be the value of the variable. This is actually fairly old. Quine, I guess, said that maybe in the 1970s or thereabouts. Quine died in December 2000. Willard Van Orman Quine, American mathematician from Harvard, other things. But to be is to be the value of a bound variable. So in modern predicate logic, you describe things not by saying the horse has a saddle or whatever. You say there is an object that is a horse and has a saddle. Right? The variable is the thing that's being a horse right now and wearing a saddle, and being brown and being, whatever. All your description is the predicate, right? So ontology. Now, Anselm's ontological argument is famous because it uses the concept of God and says that God, by definition, is that than which nothing greater can be thought. I really need to write it down. This is too much fun. I didn't bring up a working magic marker. theologian. This is close enough. So God is a being than which none greater can be conceived. This is now the theological definition. Notice this is 1100 AD, and yet the definition persists today. Contemporary theologians flippantly will refer, God, by God what I mean is that than which nothing greater can be thought, or something of that sort. Notice it's in the negative. This is used as referred to as the via negativa, the negative way. Via means way, like road, Roman road, via, right? And negativa, right? So the negative way. The reason it's negative because you're not assigning predicate characteristics to God that have to be fulfilled for you to know what you're referring to. So I'm not describing God as that big white fluffy bearded guy sitting on a throne in space defying gravity, because there is no gravity in space. He's floating on the chair somehow, right? You don't have to describe God with predicates that the character actually satisfies. Instead, what I'm describing as God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So I just say that I can't conceive of anything greater than God. So I'm not describing God, except in relationship to everything else, that nothing can be as great as God. So you don't have to be able to conceive of God. Yes?
That just seems like you're pulling more from that statement that's there. It's not saying that nothing can be equal, it's saying nothing can be greater.
Yeah, equal or greater. We wouldn't say anything could be equal. Oh, I see what...
That's not what the statement is, though.
Which none greater can be conceived. Yeah, well, you wouldn't argue that God has an equal. So you wouldn't say that anything is equal to or greater than God. You would say, if I were going to put it like on some sort of a mathematical basis, no, I would the opposite, right? I don't teach math usually. In fact, past like maybe 5th grade, no. So God is greater. I'm not even going to do the equal then for anything you pick. Everything, whatever, right? Everything. Right? And that's, you would have to also add today, you'd have to add the non-identity clause, not including God itself. So I wouldn't want to be caught in like a computer loop to say that God is greater even than God, because then the computer will crash and kill me. If you're familiar with HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, this has happened before, and it's always been attributed to human error. You forgot, to put the right code in here to keep yourself alive, says HAL, which is IBM. Right, HAL is, yes?
I believe so. It's been a long time since I've seen that movie.
Yeah, but HAL, one letter back, IBM, that was of course one of the jokes, plenty of jokes, I guess, in the movie. I did not watch the movie while on LSD, which apparently was supposed to be the right way to watch it.
It's not too late.
No, I'm not gonna. One of my friends could probably arrange it for me, but no, I'm not gonna. I'd have to go to Tennessee anyway, he's in Tennessee. I'm not gonna mention the name, because I'm recording this and posting it. Oh, I did say he was in Tennessee, so he'll know I mentioned him if he watches it. But that's okay, I only have one friend in Tennessee. So, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And not suggesting anything could be equal to it either. I don't think the language ever was interpreted that way. But so, it's negative in the sense that I don't have to know anything about God, the referent of the concept God, to then continue discussing what I'm doing here. I mean, there are plenty of people that would argue that you're just talking nonsense. That's, I mean, you know, we get into the critiques of this argument. It's famous for pretty darn good reasons, right? But by saying that, okay, things do exist. There are things that exist. Pizza is my favorite to bring up in this particular case. There are pizzas. There are pizzas in Eagle River. I happen to know there are 3 DiGiorno pizzas in packages that you could buy. I usually have 3 in my freezer that I could refer to, but at the moment I do not have any. But I happen to know there are pizzas. There are probably some across the street at Pizza Man. Now, if I ask you, is there a largest pizza? I didn't say greatest, because you might get into a lot more arguments over greatest, because it depends on what you prefer, right? You know, then we might, well, you might prefer chicken, you might prefer pineapple, ham, anchovies, who knows what you prefer, so we could get into arguments over which pizza is greatest. But if we're asking, is there a largest pizza? What is the answer? Is there a largest pizza? I mean, it might take a really sophisticated measurement device to actually, you know, because I'm sure 2 of them are made almost exactly the same way, right? But doesn't there have to be a largest pizza in Eagle River? As annoying as that might be, I mean, it's not like I'm actually going to go out and look for one. But since there are pizzas, there has to be a largest one. Might be being eaten at the moment, so it's no longer largest. Ha ha.
But then there would be another largest.
Then there would be another largest and a smallest. And in fact, we could expand that and say in Alaska, that's to be the largest pizza in the United States, in the world, in the universe. Notice how we're doing that. I mean, does that prove that there is really such a largest pizza? Are you absolutely confident that since there are pizzas, that somewhere in the world is a largest pizza in the world?
No. The universe is infinite. And depending on what theory you subscribe to, the amount of universes are infinite. So to say that pizza doesn't exist on another planet or another Earth, thinking dimensionally, would be
But he
false.
said
It'd still be a
biggest
largest.
But there would
world.
still have to be a largest.
No, he said the biggest period.
Oh, well, there still is something.
Well, on Earth,
The
Oh, okay.
difference is.
among those on Earth, there would have to be a largest one.
The difference is though, you have to assume
Ganilion,
there's
or
a-
however you pronounce Ganlion, whatever, the G monk that argues with Anselm in the Proslogion, brings up the island, the Golden Island, right? So there's, you know, wow, Anselm. Because Anselm, of course, will then, so since pizzas exist, and there's the largest pizza, God, which by definition is that than which nothing greater can be thought, must exist. Else, or otherwise, pizza exists, and pizza is greater than God, because something that exists is greater than something that doesn't exist. But by definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So therefore, God must exist. If other things exist, and by definition, so by definition, So, in a way, the argument isn't an argument from a cosmos where you're looking at things. Instead, it's from the definition itself. I'm, in a sense, cheating, but obviously they do too in the same article, arguing about the island. You know, Ghanilian will argue that there's I can imagine a golden island. It's greater than any other island, right? Golden, it's a gold island. Well, but you know, there are no gold islands. So just because I can think of something existing doesn't make it exist, right? Well, I can think of a pizza with crab on it. That doesn't make it exist in Anchorage at the moment. There might be one, but just thinking that there's a pizza with crab on it doesn't make it exist. Even though, since there are pizzas, there has to be a largest one, right? It doesn't work with something that's imaginary, right? But the thing is, Anselm points out that God, in this sense, doesn't have to be given any characteristics like having crab or anything, right? It's just, since there are things, God, by definition, has to be that than which nothing greater can be conceived or thought. So God must exist. It doesn't mean that anything else is characteristic of God. The definition doesn't give you that. It just guarantees that something that we can refer to as that than which nothing greater than can be thought must exist. And by the way, we say that's God. So therefore God exists. The conclusion.
So in other words, he's kind of like saying that the greatest thing that can be thought of would be labeled God?
Yes.
So it's not assuming that God exists, it's just saying that the greatest thing out there, be it
Right.
a law of
So
physics
it could be the universe.
or whatever,
It
should be
turns out the
labeled
universe
God
or the
because God
multiverse
should
is
be
That's a
all-
really good point. It's not claiming existence. It's just claiming that if it existed, that's what it would be.
Yes. But in a sense, because there are other things that exist, and by definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Since if other things exist, then if God doesn't exist, you're claiming that the pizza is God?
So it's just saying that out of everything
No,
that
because I can
exists.
conceive things greater than the pizza.
When I'm at this point, I'm thinking of Pizza the Hut in the movie, right? God will send out for you. You know? Yeah, Spaceballs. He's delicious, you know.
So all they're saying essentially is that the greatest thing that does exist, whether or not we know what that thing is
Well,
God.
now you're putting it in the affirmative, which they deliberately avoid.
They're saying the greatest thing that could exist.
Well, I mean, what they're getting around is it's obvious that you're imagining things in the first place.
Mhm.
But once you've imagined that, you know, God by definition is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then it must also exist in reality. Otherwise, it's not that than which. Because I can think of something else.
It also
that's greater.
doesn't rule out things being greater. There's just things that can't be conceived.
Right, right, and we're not saying God is a two-headed, sees, there's a Greek God that has two heads. What the heck is his name?
Gemini.
Which,
Gemini.
Gemini?
Got two heads.
There's another one though that has a head facing this way and this way.
That's Gemini.
Sounds painful.
Janus, is it Gemini?
That's Roman.
That is Roman. That's the one that I was thinking of. Well, but so this is the basic argument, though, that we have, by definition, God defined as that than which nothing greater can be thought. Of course, there are stuffs out there, and therefore, well, but God, by definition, has to be greater than those. You know, otherwise, pizza exists, and pizza is greater than God. No, that's dumb. So there's some really frustrating things about this, because it doesn't tell you that God has any other characteristics except that God is the logically necessary being. So they will also refer to it that way. So when you refer to everything else as temporary, you can conceive of it as being here and not. You know, I will be dead someday. Pretty darn sure of that. And when I am, I'll email you and tell you, yes, I'm dead now. And not only that, I've got it on record so that I've said it. So just look up this video and you'll hear me say, yes, I'm dead. If you're watching this, that means I'm dead. People have done this. You've probably seen movies about this. If you're watching this, I know that means I'm dead now, and you can open the envelope, and you'll notice I left you nothing, or whatever, My bills, I sent you my bills. No, but so God by definition, just means that God exists. That's all. Not any other characteristics. God is a nice person, logical, a person, consciousness, none of those things. Just the very frustrating requirement that God must exist. Annoying, just to annoy people, and it's not going to annoy or be helpful to anyone who wants to say, "See, you should be a Christian," because it's not specifically a Christian kind of God. It could be the universe. What typically the physicist will think of is, like Stephen Hawking famously, if we understand the grand unified theory, we'll know the mind of God, which is a misspelling because G-U-T doesn't spell God, it's gut. That was supposed to be funny. No one laughed. G-U-T, grand unified theory. Not God. But that's one of the very last lines of his book, A Brief History of Time. So we can, though, immediately think of some critiques of this. Ghanilian argued as well, but there's this Golden Island thing. But guess what? There aren't Golden Islands, so just imagining something doesn't mean that we can also imagine it as necessarily existing. Well, but the trouble is God isn't that kind of thing as a Golden Island, as you pointed out. Yes, it escapes us from the dilemma of things that, like unicorns, Golden Islands, beers that aren't alcoholic, that are really beer, that kind of stuff. No, God has to be existing because, by definition, all the things that exist can't be greater than it. So therefore, God must exist. I sometimes puzzle it out as the mathematical concept of the infinite. If we have 1, 2, 3, 4, what's the highest number? Obviously the infinite. But that's also puzzling because some mathematicians will tell you that the infinite doesn't actually exist. So is it the highest number? But in a way you could play with that and say, well, even mathematicians will tell you that you can't take the infinite number and add 1 and get the infinite plus 1. Because if you add 1 to it, it's still the infinite number. If you multiply it times 2, it's still the infinite, right? That's the rule. Anything times the infinite is infinite. That's the answer. so it seems to survive those kinds of critiques. The critique that will come in the 1800s comes from Immanuel Kant, who points out that it's an incomplete sentence. The conclusion, God exists, is essentially saying God is, and then you left the rest of the sentence empty, because existence is basically the verb to be. God is what? Well, the very thing that enables this to work is that you didn't give it any other descriptor, and now all of a sudden point out, well, we don't have any grounds for actual existence without such a predicate. Well, but that doesn't really work. A lot of folks point out, well, actually existence is a predicate all by itself. This magic marker exists, this one doesn't. So that actually seems to be okay. So after Kant, you have an awful lot of individuals like Hegel and all that say, of course it works, it's excellent. So there are folks still today that will argue, it's not even an argument. It's not a valid argument. You hear that also. So there's lots of arguments that, basically folks will just say, no, you don't have to be persuaded. On the other hand, isn't it extremely ticklish to the mind that you get stuck with this kind of puzzle? By the way, it seems to me to work with lots of other things. So for example, we could say, blank is that than which nothing worse can be conceived. That makes the back of my hair go up. Because what do you put there? Satan? What do you... Well, if you think about it, if it works for the good, it works for the reverse. What about the greenest thing? That jacket is the greenest thing I've ever seen today. Well, that's...
What about your sweater?
Yeah, this is pretty green. This is the greenest thing, the tastiest thing, the pinkest thing, the highest thing, all those things, the muddiest thing. Right? If there are muddy things, there's the muddiest thing in Eagle River. That works. Yes? So we can also say, well, this is telling us something about our language, how our language works and persuades us. And that could be psychologically interesting to puzzle that out. However, it's still famous. One of the most interesting versions of it, I understand, is Gödel's ontological proof. Lots of arguments about that. Kurt Gödel is a Platonist, a friend of Einstein. Main reason Einstein moved to Princeton, so he could live next to they gave Gödel a house next to Einstein. They both had houses on the same street. A friend of mine used to see them walking on Princeton's campus. So kind of interesting. But in any case, so they had their own math institute there, which has been moved. But Gödel is that's the Gödel that's there. Rebecca Goldstein, who happens to be this guy's wife, wrote a book about them titled, I think, Infinities. Let me check. See if I find it. Oh, sorry. Incompleteness. A different proof. The incompleteness theorem is the argument that no complex system is complete, that he's actually proved that. Basically, what it means is, as I interpret it, that you have to have axioms for any complex system, and those axioms basically are undoubtable. You have to believe them. And then based on those axioms, you can prove the propositions, QED, that follow from them. But guess what? You cannot use those propositions to prove the axioms. You have to accept the axioms. They must be true in the system, but they can't be proven to be true in the system. So the system is always going to be incomplete. Is that mean and rotten, or what? It irritated the heck out of Bertrand Russell, which is kind of a whole history of interesting stuff, that fascinating stuff. But can you imagine Steven Pinker and Rebecca Goldstein at night? What a relationship that must be. To actually see the two of them together. Somebody made a cartoon. Here's the two.
Said right about Plato, I decided I was going to try to solve this problem for myself, at least, come up with a theory as to why the Greeks discovered why they were such high achievers. And I did. I came up with a theory. I expected that to get the most attention from the book. I expected all the academics to attack me and say, you know, how dare you come up with a new theory of the Greeks. Nobody's paying any attention to that so far. The thing that's getting all the attention.
So, just so you, two of my heroes in one room, one marriage. Pretty weird. Okay, so Anselm, ontological argument, still famous, still people arguing over it. Some great lines here. I noticed I already went up a little bit. Chapter 2. Truly there is a God, although the fool has said in his heart there is no God. So that's actually a quote from Scripture, Isaiah, I think. So it repeats historically in lots of literature, not only here. I wonder, when he says it in this context, which fool he has in mind. I'm convinced he's the fool himself that he's thinking about. And I think this is when someone who's obviously dedicated his life to God, to the church, is writing this while he is the Archbishop in Canterbury. Actually, there was a time he was the abbot of a monastery too. It might have been written while he was that. But in any case, he's writing this, and I'm sure he had a moment of doubt himself. I mean, that's kind of absolutely natural. To doubt if there really is a God. So the fool has said in his heart there is no God. And then, of course, the neat thing is he comes up with a proof that's going to persuade himself to think that, yes, of course there must be. The real question then becomes, what other characteristics does God actually have? That's where, the real work has to be, So, number one, you accept that there is such a thing as that than which nothing greater can be thought. What is it? That's still today what I think physicists are trying to do. I mentioned Pope Benedict as defining, we have language needs for something that basically satisfies the idea that there's a creator of some sort that made everything in the first place. The second language need is that it cares for us. So Jesus, basically, is the Christian explanation for that. And then I neglected to mention the third thing, the Holy Spirit, which is the Spirit of God among us. So in other words, the source of positive moral good feeling that, by the way, Steven Pinker talks about as humanism, is part of our culture, right? So if you think of it, that is the same kind of structural influence on the universe that enables the universe to be so perfect for life, apparently, that without the odd measurement of energy in the universe exactly the way it's set up, suns wouldn't be there, planets wouldn't be there, atmospheres, etc. So in some sense, it seems anthropomorphic. Everything is arranged beautifully for us to be where we are, etc. And it's not just in that sense. It also, as another really neat book is Carl Sagan's son, Dorian Sagan, Into the Cool. Fascinating, pointing out that, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, is that all complex systems, closed complex systems, lose energy and gradually deteriorate and collapse, right? Everything dies, basically, and yet life continues on and becomes more and more complex. Well, we're not a closed system. We have sunlight, but at the same time, life keeps getting more and more complex. So it's like life fights the second law of thermodynamics. Pretty interesting. And that would tie in beautifully with this, I think. So. Sorry. I got lost. Boethius, Anselm, moving into the early medieval period, we have some significant individuals. Abelard is pretty famous. Abelard, let's see, Stealing Heaven.
There is much to lead one astray in this world. Is it nobler to resist temptation or to avoid it?
It was an age of obedience when the scriptures ruled. It was